Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to talk about calf feeding behavior and its influence on future milk production. Welcome, Dr. Kertz. Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's good to be back. To survive the eclipse yesterday, so we're going on.
Now we move forward, right, from
Right.
that event. What do we got? 24 years or something now in the next one here. So,
Yeah.
for those of you that are joining us here today, we thank you for taking time to tune in. And if you have any questions, feel free to post those there in the chat area on your screen. If you're joining us from social media, simply post your questions directly in those channels. So if you also, Al's going to be talking about a column he wrote for Feedstuffs, and that column is going to be posted there in the chat as well if you want to check that out. So, Dr. Kertz, over to you.
Well, this subject has been explored in a little bit different way, and that's the first paragraph of the article. Briefly, I'll address, and that is the impact of calf performance and subsequent milk production. That was addressed in a study at Cornell and published in 2012. You can find that in more detail in my book. It's near the end of the book itself. But what they found that for every additional a pound of daily gain difference prior to weaning, that's a range of a pound, that resulted in 850 pounds more milk in the first lactation and 2,280 pounds over the following three lactations. Now, it's an astonishing result. Now, one of the reasons they were able to pick this out was because they had over 10 years of records and about 1,200 calves that they could follow through the herd. And so that often limits individual studies in what they can find because they don't have enough data where there's a lot of variation. So that's going to be a factor in the study that we're going to look at. This study was published last year by Swartz and Peterson Wolf. It was actually done at the Virginia Tech Dairy, and it was done over a period from November 2014 through August 2016. So that's about a 2-year period. And it was based on feeding behavior on an automatic calf feeding, milk replacer feeding setup. And then, of course, they had to wait for those calves to grow through the heifer period and to complete the first lactation. So that's often another reason why you don't see many longer term studies, is because they take too long. In this case, it would take 2 years to grow the heifer, to have the first calf, and another year to have the first lactation. So that's a minimum of 3 years after you actually do the calf measurements. So these calves were fed 4 liters of colostrum first feeding, and then 12 hours later, another 3 liters. And then there were 146 female calves, but there were 104 Holstein and 42 Jerseys. So that introduces more variation too in the data, because you've got different body weights and different intakes and then different levels of milk production. All calves were housed in individual hutches until they were about 8 days old. Then they were moved into the group, and the group was not static. In other words, the whole group was not moved in at a time, and then after they were weaned, they were all moved out. So it was a continuous flow of calves into the group, and then when they finished, they moved out of the group. And they were fed a step-up program. They started out with 2 liters of milk replacer, and then they were also fed a 26 protein and 20% crude fat milk replacer during the winter, a higher fat to increase energy intake. Otherwise, it was a 27 protein and 10% crude fat milk replacer. They were group housed, so there was sawdust bedded pack. They were continuously added to the group, as we said, and they averaged about 10 calves. They were also fed through an automatic waterer, and they were fed a texturized calf starter. But unfortunately, the calf starter was fed in a feed trough, so there were no intakes. Now, granted, you couldn't get individual intakes, but you could get group intakes over a period of time. And the same thing with the automatic water. There was no water intake data that was accounted for. So they were fed starting at a lower level of about, let's see, about 4 liters twice a day. Well, now more than twice a day, because that's how the feeder was set up. And they went all the way up to 12 liters a day. So that's a high level of intake. Then they were stepped down over a 10-day period and weaned at the end of 49 days, or 7 weeks. And so that's the data that were collected. Now, they were able to monitor the calves for what is called a rewarded visit and a non-rewarded visit. So there was so much allocated for a calf per day in meals at certain time intervals. And as long as there was something available for that calf that day, when the calf came up to the automatic feeder, then it could drink that amount. But if it had already used its allotment for the day and the calf came up, it wasn't able to drink anything because it didn't have any more allotment. So that categorized their visits into rewarded visits or unrewarded visits. And one of the questions that was raised is, if there's an unrewarded visit and the calf couldn't drink any more milk replacer, did it then go and eat more starter because it was still hungry? And we don't have any way of knowing with this particular setup. So let's take a look then at the data in the first table. So if you look at the mean and standard deviation, and I also did a little calculation of my own, what's commonly called the coefficient of variation. It's a percent. So if you take the standard deviation as a percent of the mean, then that tells you what the coefficient of variation is. So there were 3.8 daily unrewarded visits. I thought that was a fairly high number. So almost 4 times a day, calves would come up to the feeder and they didn't have any more allotment. And then the standard deviation, though, was 2.1. So that 2.1 as a percent of 3.8 is 55%. That's really high. So there's a lot of variation in that particular data. Rewarded visits, there were 7, and there was 2.3. So the variation dropped. It was about 30% as compared to the unrewarded visits, but still a considerable variation. Daily visit drinking speed. So the feeding equipment could monitor the milliliters per minute that they drank at, and that the average of 587 milliliters. So that's about almost 0.6 of a liter per minute they were drinking. And then 112 was the standard deviation. So that's about 19%. So we have less variation there. Their daily milk replacer intake as dry was 2.32 pounds, and 0.33 was the standard deviation. So that's a very high level, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Age of first calving was 706. That's about 24 months of age. So that's a good number to shoot at. It's a little under 24. And 47 days, so that's only 7%. The standard deviation is only 7% of the mean. So there's quite a bit less variation in that number than in any other numbers we looked at. Then when you look at the first lactation milk, the ME is a mature equivalent calculation based on the age at which the heifers calved the first time. So 30,000 pounds was the mean, but the standard deviation is 5,300. That's 18%. Now, keep in mind, that's a fairly high number because about a third of the calves, or the cows in this case, were jerseys. So you have a combination of that data together. You look at the 305 protein yield, that was 965 pounds, 137 was the standard deviation. That's about 14%. Now notice that the protein yield, the percentage I calculated was 3.2%. That would be a little bit high for Holsteins, but remember you got jerseys which run higher numbers, so that brings that average up a bit. And the same thing for fat. It was about 1,143 pounds of fat, and the 150 pounds of standard deviation, so that's about 13%. So the fat average almost 4%. So that's typically higher than you would expect with Holsteins, but you have some jerseys. About a third of that is due to jerseys. Then if you correct it on a fat corrected milk basis, 305 days, so you standardize it for the age with mature equivalent, standardize it for 30-day lactation, and standardize it for fat, the average was 32,000 pounds, which is a high average, and 4,241 pounds of standard deviation, are about 13%. So those are the data then that were recorded with the equipment that they had to monitor the rate at which they drank, how often they drank, how often they weren't allowed to drink because they had fulfilled their requirement for the day already, their allotment, I should say, and then the actual milk production. Now, if we go look at table 2, we see some correlations that were done with that data. So if you looked at the daily unrewarded visits and the daily rewarded visits, it's 0.1. Now, 1 would be an ideal 100% correlation. So 0.1 means that there's very little relationship between those two factors, the daily rewarded and daily unrewarded. However, when you look at this drinking speed and daily unrewarded visits, it was 0.37. So that's becoming more significant. And then when you look at the milk replacer intake, it was 0.5. And this is for daily unrewarded visits. Now, when we look at the daily rewarded visits, you don't see as high a correlation for those categories. So it makes you wonder why that came out to be that way. And I'm not quite sure I know either. The speed doesn't have much of a correlation for rewarded visits or drinking speeds, but it does for unrewarded visits and does for milk replacer intake. And then when you look at the milk replacer intake, we've seen those numbers up above already. So when you look at all these data, the highest numbers are drinking speed correlated with milk replacer intake, 0.36, and daily unrewarded visits and milk replacer intake, 0.51. Okay, so those are significant. There also was some significant with first lactation, mature 305 fat corrected milk. And so it's most likely that these calves are still hungry. So that comes back to the question I had before, which is there were a fairly high number of unrewarded visits. So what happens with those calves if they're still hungry? Do they eat more starter? And when they eat more starter, typically they drink more water along with the starter. And so we don't have those two key pieces of information to fill out this picture, and that would have been good to have, even though while the water was on a metered system, you wouldn't have individual intakes by the calves of water with that system. And if you put the feed in a trough, of course, you don't have individual intake of the calves of the starter intake either. Another factor, though, was that the daily milk replacer intake was 2.3 pounds. There's another study I cite in the two studies in this references, in which they found that when you feed about 1.67 pounds more daily milk replacer, that's on a dry basis, mixed and fed as a liquid, that begins to reduce the starter intake before weaning, and it has a carryover effect in reducing starter intake, daily gain, and digestibility after weaning if you have a high level of feeding, like it was in this study of 2.3. But those data were not collected, so we don't know for sure what happened to these calves. But we do know that that's a practical problem because there's a 2018 NOM study that I have referenced in which field data were collected, and was found that prior to weaning, calves on these commercial herds average 1.6 pounds daily gain. Now that's good prior to weaning, because when you take the birth weight and you want to double it at 60 days, you have to be about the 1.5 or 1.6 daily gain. So that's good. But what I found in looking at their data and calculating it, was that after weaning, the month after weaning, they should have increased from 1.6 pounds to about 1.8 or so, but they actually decreased down to 1.3 pounds after weaning. That's indication that maybe they fed too much milk or milk replacer and didn't get enough starter for a long enough period of time so that they had good rumen development when they were weaned. So after weaning, then they struggle a bit because they don't have as good an intake. The rumen's not as well developed, can't handle the intake, and so they have a lag and a slump in effect when that occurs. So those are some of the questions that are raised by a study of this type, given what the
Sounds like there's, yeah, a few more things to look into before we make any hard and facts from this. Seems like there's some things that we didn't evaluate and probably should have been evaluated.
Well, and the other factor too, of course, and I don't want to, discredit the study because it's a valid study, but they only had about 160 calves. So given the variation, that's not a lot of calves. It's much better than what you could do in a study for 2 months or something like that. But if you recall, when I started, talked about this Cornell data, they had 1,200 calves, and they were able to pull out significant differences. And then they were able to look at other individual studies. There's about 8 or 10 other studies that have been done looking at performance of calves before weaning and milk production, but they didn't have the numbers, so they weren't able to pull that difference out. Now, when you combine all these studies in a meta-analysis, then you're more likely to be able to pull these data out, these relationships out of data, because you have more data. So this is a good study to begin with, but it raises questions that we ought to be able to follow up on.
So then, Al, when you take an overall look at all of this, what would you say then is your bottom line here?
Well, the bottom line is that we need more data to look at this relationship. I'm puzzled why there were that high a number of unrewarded visits when they actually had a high level of milk replacer feeding. And then the other question is, when these calves were unrewarded, did they go and eat more starter? And then how did they do overall? Because there weren't body weights. There were some birth weights done, but there weren't body weights and average daily gains done during the calves in these 49-day study either. So that's just another heightened missing piece of information we'd like to have.
Very good. So as we indicated, you can find Al's column there in the chat. You can also find it in our upcoming April edition of Feedstuffs, our digital edition. Thank you, Dr. Kertz, for sharing your insight and thoughts with us here today.
Good. We'll see you next month.
Very good. Likewise, we appreciate all of you for joining us. We know how busy your schedule is, so giving us a little bit of your day, we really appreciate that. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format, so you can just go to feedstuffs.com, click on Feedstuffs 365 in the nav bar, and you can take a look and share those as you like. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.